Your goals for learning are: blood pressure is the force that blood exerts against blood vessel walls. The pumping. Notice that the blood cells in the center of the vessel are flowing faster than those near the walls. By taking your pulse, you can feel that blood pressure fluctuates with each heartbeat. The pulse that you feel is actually a pressure wave which starts from the heart and travels throughout the arteries. We can use the graph created by this pressure wave to identify the component parts of blood pressure. Systolic pressure is the maximum pressure exerted by the blood against the artery walls. It is the result of ventricular systole, contraction, and is normally about 120 millimeters of mercury. The dichrotic notch represents the interruption of smooth flow due to the brief backflow of blood that closes the aortic semilunar valve. Diastolic pressure represents the lowest pressure in the artery, which is the result of ventricular diastole, relaxation. Diastolic pressure is usually around 80 millimeters of mercury. Pulse pressure represents the difference between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. Pulse pressure equals systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. Pulse pressure is the throb that you feel when you take your pulse. Mean arterial pressure, abbreviated MAP, is a calculated average pressure in the arteries. Mean arterial pressure equals the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. Mean arterial pressure is not simply calculated as the average of systolic pressure and diastolic pressure because diastole lasts longer than systole, and so the mean arterial pressure is closer to the diastolic pressure than it is to the systolic pressure. The mean arterial pressure is the force that propels the blood to the tissues throughout the cardiac cycle. When blood pressure is measured, a cuff is inflated to constrict an artery in the arm so that no blood flows through the artery. Click the bulb repeatedly to inflate the cuff until blood. Now the pressure in the cuff is greater than the pressure in the artery, and therefore the artery is closed off with no blood flowing through it. As the cuff pressure is gradually released, but the artery is still partially constricted, blood flow resumes. Sounds can be heard with a stethoscope because the blood flows turbulently, causing audible sounds. Now, click on the bulb valve to deflate the cuff and hear the sounds.
Hi. Just a point of information here. Sometimes your instructor or your clinical agency wants 2 values recorded for diastolic pressure. When this is the case, don't panic. The first diastolic reading is recorded when the sound muffles. The second is recorded as instructed here, when the sound disappears. See ya!
To determine the blood pressure in this simulation, click on the bulb repeatedly. Now, click on the bulb's valve to begin deflating the cuff. Here's a summary of what we've covered. Systolic pressure is the highest pressure in an artery. It is the result of ventricular contraction, or systole, pushing blood into the aorta and through the arteries. Diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure in an artery. It results from ventricular relaxation, or diastole. Pulse pressure equals systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. Mean arterial pressure, or MAP, equals diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. When blood pressure is measured, your goals for one of the main factors that affects blood pressure is peripheral resistance. Blood cells and plasma encounter resistance. Let's look at how vessel diameter affects peripheral resistance. As the diameter of a tube . In a similar fashion, constriction of blood vessels raises blood pressure. Vessel diameter is actively regulated Blood vessel diameter is also regulated by vasoconstrictors carried in the blood. Click on each eyedropper to see the effect of these vasoconstrictors.
Hi, I'm excited to be here to tell you about these vasoconstrictors. Epinephrine is released by the adrenal medulla when the sympathetic nervous system is active. Essentially, it's the hormonal part of the sympathetic fight or flight response. Angiotensin II is generated from a blood protein when blood pressure drops. What happens here is that the kidneys respond to low blood pressure by releasing an enzyme called renin to the blood. Renin, in turn, initiates the cascade that leads to the formation of angiotensin II. Vasopressin, also called antidiuretic hormone or ADH, is released by the hypothalamus when blood volume is low or when blood osmolarity is high. These last two vasoconstrictors, angiotensin II and vasopressin, are also important secondarily for their effects on the kidney. Essentially, acting together, they cause more salt in water to be absorbed, thus increasing blood volume and blood pressure. But more about that later. I'll be seeing you.
Besides vessel diameter, blood viscosity also affects peripheral resistance. Viscosity is related to the thickness of a fluid. The greater the viscosity, the less easily molecules slide past one another, and the more difficult it is to get the fluid moving and keep it moving. Because of this greater resistance to flow, more pressure is required to pump the same volume of a viscous fluid. The hematocrit is the percentage of red blood cells in the total blood volume. In addition to vessel diameter and blood viscosity, total blood vessel length also affects peripheral resistance. Increased fatty tissue requires more blood vessels to service it, and therefore adds to the total blood vessel length in the body. The longer the total vessel length, the greater the resistance the blood encounters in the vessels, and the greater the blood pressure. Click on the skin to see the effect of vessel length on blood pressure. In addition to peripheral resistance and vessel elasticity, blood volume affects blood pressure. If there is a greater volume of fluid in a tube, such as a blood vessel or a hose, then more fluid is pressing against the walls, and so the walls experience greater pressure. Conversely, with less volume, there is less pressure against the walls. Once again, we can use garden hoses to demonstrate this principle. Click each picture to see the effect of reduced blood volume, which could be due to excessive sweating, for instance, reduces blood pressure. However, this increased blood volume increases blood pressure. Water retention from excessive salt intake is one way that blood volume can be increased. Again, this is only a temporary situation. So far, we have looked at how peripheral resistance, vessel elasticity, and blood volume affect blood pressure. Cardiac output also has a direct effect on blood pressure. Anything that decreases cardiac output also decreases blood pressure because there is less pressure on the vessel walls. Conversely, an increase in cardiac output results in increased blood pressure. Recall that cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Thus, anything that affects heart rate and/or stroke volume affects cardiac output and thus blood pressure. On this screen, we will explore the effect of heart rate on blood pressure. What do you think will happen to heart rate and blood pressure with greater vagus stimulation? On this screen, we will look at the effect of stroke volume on blood pressure. If less blood is ejected from the heart with each beat, then blood pressure will be lower because there will be less blood pressing against the vessel walls, and vice versa. Obviously, blood volume directly affects end diastolic volume and therefore stroke volume. Click each button to see the effect of stroke volume on blood pressure. Here's a summary of what we've covered. Increases in peripheral resistance, blood volume, and/or cardiac output result in higher blood pressure. Conversely, decreases in any of these factors lead to lower blood pressure. There are three main sources of peripheral resistance: blood vessel diameter, blood viscosity, and total blood vessel length. If arteries lose their elasticity, blood pressure increases. To see the related chapter outline from